We're pleased to bring you this interview with the man who revealed Bob Lazar to the world, George Knapp. How did he get in contact with Bob Lazar himself? Special thanks to Dave Scott from Spaced Out Radio to share this incredible insight with you right now.
Well, I try to look at it as a news story. That's how I started down this road. It was looking at it as a news story, not as a big expose and not as a springboard to fame or infamy, as it's turned out. I tried to approach it that way. When we started with the Lazar Area 51 stuff, my news director and I had gone up to meet Lazar and to put him through his paces and ask him a bunch of questions. And when we left, I remember having the conversation, geez, if we go down this road and do a story on this, we're putting everything at risk. Our own personal reputations, our professional reputations, the reputation and credibility of the station. So we had to be careful. And we spent a lot of time digging into it and tried to present it as a straightforward news story, telling people what we found along the way. And I've maintained that approach with all of the different UFO-related stories that I've had over the years. Because of that, even though some of my media colleagues have looked at me like I'm crazy, especially when I first started down this road, and they took umbrage that somehow I was bringing disrepute to the profession in general, they've had to grudgingly accept that we've broken so many stories, and this has touched the pulse of the public in such a dramatic way that I'm sure at least a few of them wish they had got on board that. The story is so interesting and powerful and compelling, and it grabs the public by the throat. The hunger for information about this, reliable information, is strong. It was strong back then. It's stronger today. So I've tried to tell my colleagues who are skeptical about it, look, you can take whatever approach you want, but there's a lot of stuff that goes uncovered related to this topic. And there's more than enough work to go around. I think a lot of them are taking a fresh look at it now because of recent developments that I'm sure we'll talk about.
I got to ask you, I know from my old newsrooms where I worked, the reaction from my fellow journalists when it comes to UFOs, or in your case, when it came to UFOs, the Bob Lazar story and everything that went along with that. What has been the reaction over the years that you have taken from fellow journalists? Because I can just imagine what it's like, but for you, I'd love for you to explain it.
Well, at KLAS, I've had nothing but support. It was brave of them to allow me to go down this road, and they were nervous about it. Bob Stoddall was the guy who hired me at KLAS. He was my mentor. He was the guy who got me interested in Area 51 long before Bob Lazar came along, long before we heard the stories about flying saucers. He had a collection of the scant amount of material that existed about Area 51, and he passed it on to me. And he was absolutely in support. And because of his support, and because we approached it rationally and like we would any other story, and maybe with extra care because given the nature of the topic, the other people in the newsroom respected it. And now, because I've been there so long, new people come in, and a lot of them, when they're hired, they already know my name from this stuff, and everybody has pretty much accepted it. They know I'm going to try to do a good job, and I'm not going to do something to embarrass them.
News directors, if you've never worked in a newsroom, are known for being ornery, stiff people, sometimes at the best of times. How did you convince your news director to run with this story, that you had it?
Well, I was in luck because, as I mentioned a little bit ago, Bob Stoddall, the guy who hired me, a brilliant man, I think the most important Nevada journalist since Mark Twain, already had an interest in Area 51. And when I first came to the station, he gave me a file. I don't know if he figured out that that's where things would lead for me, because I was Jimmy Olsen. I was cub reporter with very little experience on the air, but he took me under his wing. And one of the things he passed on to me was Area 51, this thin little file about this mysterious base that wasn't on any maps. He said, just tuck it away. We don't have to do anything right now, but one of these days I want you to look into it. And so I started collecting little bits and pieces as I'd hear about them. In 1984, the U.S. government, the Air Force, seized 89,000 acres of land around Groom Lake. And they did it like overnight. One night it's public land. The next day there's armed guards there, and the public is prohibited from being there. And they did it without permission, and they asked for permission afterward. They told Congress that they had done it with authority that's higher than the Constitution, something along those lines, at a congressional hearing. The congressmen who heard this were shocked, but yet they kept the land. In fact, they've taken more. Now, that got everybody's attention, mine included. So we started poking around. What could they be hiding? What's so secret out there? March of 1989, I'm the co-anchor of our 5 o'clock news. We would do a 5-minute interview, live interviews segment every day on the news. And we had a last-minute cancellation. And I'd been in touch with Lear about this UFO guy that he knew, who turned out to be Bob Lazar. And I called him and said, would this guy come on? We've got a 5-minute hole in our newscast. You think this guy would come on and talk about what he knows up there? Because Lear had hinted that there had been some friction, some trouble with his work. So he says, I'll see. And they set it up. So we sent a crew, a live truck up to John Lear's house. This guy who used the pseudonym Dennis climbed in the truck, did this interview where he told about a secret base, S4, next to Papoose Lake. It was built into the side of a mountain, disguised to look like the natural terrain. They had 9 hangars with 9 alien discs out there, that the secret had been kept, that it was too big to keep, and that the public had a right to know, and that was that. Well, the general manager comes running back. Is that for real? The news director's phone is ringing off the hook. The whole newsroom is lit up. What the heck was that all about? So that was what prompted the news director, Bob Stodall, and I to set up a meeting to go meet Bob Lazar, to question him, put him through his paces, and see whether this was worth pursuing. And we came out of the meeting with Lazar and said, geez, that sounds pretty credible. He wasn't trying to sell it. He wasn't overstating his role in it. He was frank about problems in his life, in his personal life. He wasn't a saint, obviously. We figured when we left, well, this could be a multi-part series. We'll start working on this. And what it turned out to be is me working for 8 months, absorbing everything I could about UFOs in general, the cover-up issues, documents that had been released, and particularly about Bob Lazar and his background. And we went everywhere, and we focused so hard on that. And until November, when we produced this series, UFOs, the Best Evidence, and it remains the highest rated locally produced news series ever in Las Vegas. We made it into a 2-hour special. It also was the highest rated locally produced show ever. And that sort of changed my life. From there on, I was viewed by my colleagues in media as a crazy guy, and I was viewed by the public as the UFO reporter. I continued to do other stories and still break big important stories about other topics and mainstream news subjects, and won a lot of awards. But my mind was always on UFOs, and the public identified me with that topic.
You have to have some sort of confirmation that he actually did work at Area 51. Did you have those sources, and I'm not asking you to give them up, but those sources deep enough to say he's the real deal?
Well, it's a gray area. It's not a yes or no or black and white. We had a lot of sources with bits and pieces of the story that confirmed that Lazar had been out there. And we had a lot of other information, developments that happened that let us know that we're on the right track. And I'll get into those in a moment as well. I had more than 24 people who had worked at Groom Lake who could verifiably said to have been out there in either the Nevada test site or at Area 52 or at Area 51, who gave me bits and pieces of the same story. People who would say that I worked there. There was an electrical engineer, for example, who said he worked at Groom Lake and had seen a saucer under a tarp in a hangar. There was a guy who was a tax preparer who had worked for, he did the taxes for all these brass at Nellis Air Force Base, who got to know the officers and who had told them they had retrieved crashed materials out there in a bunker. More than 24 people who gave me bits and pieces of the story, including a guy who had been a manager at Area 51, who had worked for the company that was in charge of operating the facility for a long time. As Lazar had told us, that's the company that he had to go through to get hired out there. So we never had a document that said Bob Lazar worked here. We never expected to get that. But I had a lot of indications that he had worked for the government in secret programs, classified projects, as a scientist. And that's what we rested our laurels on. I ran into trouble right off the bat. Bob's resume had said he was at MIT and at Caltech. He got master's degrees. I contacted those schools, and both said, no, we got no record of him. I said, well, this is going to be a short investigation if that's the way this goes. So I started on Los Alamos. I figured, well, all right, records could disappear. As Bob had said, they're trying to make me as if I never existed. All right, we'll see. So we contact Los Alamos. Do you have any records on Bob Lazar? No, never had him. Nobody of that name was ever here in any capacity. And I find the phone book with his name in it. I go back to him and said, look, it's right here in the phone book. Well, he wasn't here. We don't have any records. We don't have anything on him. Then I find the newspaper article, front page of the Los Alamos Monitor, that shows a picture of him standing next to his jet car. And the article noted that he'd been a physicist at Los Alamos. Nope, they still denied it. Back and forth I go with letters from them. Then they find an identification number. They finally admitted, yeah, he was here. He worked for a company called Kirkmeyer, which is a headhunter firm. They hire people to fill scientific and technical positions at the lab. So I started working on Kirkmeyer. And the first time I contacted them, do you have any records on a guy named Robert Lazar? Yeah. So you hired him. You got him a job at Los Alamos? Yeah. Great. Can I get those records? Sure. Send us a formal letter with Lazar's signature on it, and we'll release it, which I did. They don't respond to me. Suddenly, they don't take my phone calls. When I get them on the phone, they say, we can't find the records anymore. Finally, they said they don't have it. We don't have any records at all. So I had a pretty good indication that there was something going on, that they were screwing with me a little bit and hiding records and were trying to obscure his background, because I had talked to people who work with him there. In fact, I went to Los Alamos with a cameraman on a Sunday morning, and Lazar escorted us in, and we go into the lab. Doesn't say much for the security of Los Alamos. We went into the lab. He waves to the guy at the gate. We go in, and he's taking us all into all these different buildings. It was like a rabbit going through its own burrow. Everywhere he goes, he's saying hi to people. Nobody stopped us. He showed us around. We take our camera in to the giant particle accelerator and took pictures of it. That happened. So when I have the lab telling me that he was never there, and the company that hired him saying they never hired him, and people who work with him saying, yeah, he was here in scientific positions on classified projects, I knew I was onto something.
How did the death threats end? Because we know that they were trying to shoot him. We know about the Uzi in his car with the doors open when he comes out from the gym. Did that have anything to do with, and maybe I'm just throwing darts at a dartboard here, but did that have anything to do with the fact that eventually he would get involved with Mr. Robert Bigelow looking for element 115?
No, because nobody knew Robert Bigelow at that time. Nobody knew that he had an interest in UFOs. I didn't. Lazar didn't. He hadn't funded NIDS. He hadn't given money to Friedman or any of those folks. No one knew his name in these circles. There weren't any reports in UFO magazines or in the Las Vegas papers or anything of the sort. So the threats that happened to Lazar, I don't know that they were actually trying to kill him. I think they were trying to scare him. Because certainly if they wanted him dead, they could have killed him. And the intrusions at his home, where they would go in and mess around in his lab, move around the furniture, and wipe off his blackboard and make it very obvious that they'd been in there. The incident with his car, where they open the doors and windows in the glove box and leave the gun there. Shooting at the tire. They didn't have to shoot the tire. They could have shot at him if they wanted him dead. I came to believe that Lazar, for all of his faults, for all of the problems in his personal life, was the perfect guy for that job. A brilliant guy who thinks outside the box, somebody you could bring into a project that would give you a new thought process, that would maybe help break the logjam, because that's what they had out there. And I think they still have it, in trying to figure out the technology that came from somewhere. It certainly is not ours. They were reverse engineering it to try to figure out how it worked and whether they could duplicate it, not putting it together. And it wasn't from here.